Good. All
Thank you,
right.
Ted, and thank you for giving us this chance to reflect on this really strange time with all of you. As an introvert, I kind of feel like I've inherited the earth. I know that social distancing and self-isolation is a bit of an imposition for many. For me, it's kind of an opportunity and even a way of life. So I'm kind of thriving at the moment and doing my best to step forward. So extroverts among you, we've got your back. We're gonna do what we can to keep the ship moving forward. I wanted to really just let you know we've been undergoing a bit of a process of continual assessment of the impacts and implications of what's going on, and really thinking about what TDC's strategic response should be, and that this is very much still a work in progress. We'll be doing some intensive scenario planning using different assumptions about the severity of what we're facing. First, regarding the public health crisis and the direct medical impacts of the pandemic. And second, really the economic impacts in both the short and medium term. I confess that regarding the first, the medical impacts, I'm somewhat in the dark, and many of you may have a better idea, but we're certainly already getting a handle on the latter, on the economic impacts. And so I wanted to hand over really at this point to Thomas to survey the immediate economic impacts that we're seeing to date, and then I'll look forward a bit more speculatively. Thomas?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So as you probably are all no doubt aware at this point, this country in particular, but the world more generally, is facing an economic crisis that is relatively unprecedented in modern history. Perhaps never before, even during the worst wars and economic crises, have people in this country been physically locked down and businesses forced to close and not open and operate. Just yesterday, the government revealed that in just 1 week, 3.3 million Americans filed for unemployment insurance, and this is more than 4 times the previous modern record, which was set in the 1980s. The modern record only goes back to the 60s, however. It's also more than 4 times the single week record of any time during the 2008-2009 Great Recession and financial crisis. And as many of you know, this is probably only the tip of the iceberg. It doesn't count furloughed workers or the potentially millions of workers who are unable to navigate the quite complex unemployment system that we have in this country, which in many states is actually consciously designed to dissuade people from applying for unemployment insurance. A few days ago, the St. Louis Fed estimated that the unemployment rate in this country could reach 32.1% in the second quarter, which is a staggering 52.8 million Americans potentially out of work. Just a couple more stats. Both Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley are now suggesting that we could see a GDP decline of around 30% in quarter 2. And this is on top of an unknown decline in quarter 1, as well as potential further decline in quarter 3 if this pandemic continues. And by contrast, the total decline from peak to trough during the 2008-2009 financial crisis was minus 4.3%. So the only thing comparable to what we're seeing now economically in this country is the Great Depression in the 1930s. And during that crisis, GDP fell for around 30% and unemployment peaked at 25%. So on the unemployment front, we could see levels that are in excess of the Great Depression. So are we headed for another Great Depression? Well, yes and no. We are indeed definitely going into a deep, deep recession. But unlike 80 years ago, there are some fundamental differences. I think first and foremost, this recession has not, as of yet, included a financial crisis, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, and why that's the case. And second, while this recession is likely to be very, very deep, it may also be relatively quick, and when the threat of the virus ends, the recession may also end with it. By contrast, the Great Depression lasted around 10 years. I haven't seen anyone suggesting that this will last that long, although the longer it goes on, the more long-term damage there will be to the economy, and the harder it will be to get out of it. So I guess I'll just end with a sort of a brief discussion about why there hasn't been a financial crisis so far. And the simple answer to that is pretty unprecedented government economic action and intervention. And unlike during the 1929 crash and the ensuing years, this was when sort of free market liberalism reigned and Hoover was in the White House, and they did very little to sort of intervene into the crash until it got very, very deep. Here, there's been absolutely no hesitation this time around about using the various levers of government action and intervention. And so the Federal Reserve immediately started deploying all the tools in its arsenal to stop a financial crisis from occurring. It slashed interest rates to zero. It restarted its quantitative easing program. It's provided trillions in liquidity support to the financial system. It's even gone further than that and done things that previously the Fed said that they couldn't do. And so someone mentioned earlier about, what this crisis is exposing, and I'd love to talk more about that. But, all the things that they said that we couldn't do in an economy, suddenly you can do, when you decide you want to do them. And so one of those things that the Federal Reserve said that they couldn't do in the past that they're now doing is buying up municipal bonds to allow for local and state governments to continue to borrow. On top of this, Congress is in the final stages of a massive economic bailout program, which I think a lot of people are erroneously calling a stimulus, but it's really not. It's a bailout program. It's a $2 trillion package, which will then unlock another $4 trillion or so in Federal Reserve lending authority. And so it's actually a $6 trillion package, which is absolutely unprecedented in American history. I mean, if you think about the size of our economy, it's, you're talking like, almost half, the size of our economy just in the stimulus package. And on Wednesday night, it passed the Senate unanimously, 96-0, after a lot of back and forth. And I think that's also worth reflecting on a bit, because it really demonstrates to me how dead the free market myth really is now in this country. Just 10 years ago, during the financial crisis, a much, much smaller bailout package was actually initially voted down in Congress and then subsequently only passed by a 74-25 margin. Now we're doing $6 trillion, 100% unanimous approval. And so I'll end by just saying that I think while we'll need to wait a couple of days to do a full analysis of this bailout package, it appears at the outset to just be a corporate giveaway of pretty epic proportions. Various industries are going to be handed hundreds of billions of dollars in public money with very few strings attached. There's going to be a large slush fund in the hands of Mnuchin and Treasury to do with what they will. There's a unnamed company that's critical to national defense earmarked, which everyone knows is Boeing. So there's going to be just massive corporate giveaway. There's been a lot of discussion in the lead up to this bailout package about whether or not there'll be requirements about transferring equity or ownership in exchange for bailout cash. I think while this is theoretically still on the table, it's going to be very much at the discretion of Mnuchin and Larry Kudlow and others in the administration, and I really don't have high hopes that they're going to follow through on any of their sort of public musings on this topic. And obviously, in the meantime, individuals and small businesses are really getting pennies on the dollar. I mean, Trump had a really important line yesterday that many people actually seem to have missed. And he said that restaurants will open and thrive again, but maybe not under the current ownership. And I think this is true for business in general. Like, what this crisis may actually do is, and this crisis fueled by this extremely inequitable bailout package, is actually facilitate a massive transition and concentration of ownership into corporate and elite hands. I mean, it is just going to funnel wealth upwards if they have anything to say about it, the people in power. And that's one of the potential scenarios that, as Joe said, we're going to be looking at. And I think with that, I'll just turn it back over to Joe to do some of the more forward-thinking analysis.
Thank you, Thomas. I think everyone will agree that's a very sobering picture. Now I'd like to just spend a few minutes on what might come next, and then we very much look forward to hearing the views of the trustees. Our operating assumption is that, as well as an enormously difficult moment of pain and suffering for many, this pandemic and its aftermath is also an enormously important moment of crisis opportunity. Ted mentioned, never let a good crisis go to waste. That was the mantra of the neoliberals under Friedman and Hayek, and we feel that we need to be just as clear-eyed in this pivotal moment. We have a feeling that historians might well look back on the 2008 great financial crisis and then this crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic, as in some ways the bookends of a period of transition that is from a dying neoliberalism to whatever comes next. And as Marjorie was saying, that could either be the democratic economy that we are calling for, or it could be something much, much darker. We're in a really unusual and unprecedented situation, as Thomas indicated. People are talking about a wartime economy. That's actually not quite right. A wartime economy is about mobilization. This situation, at least in its first phase, is about the opposite. It's about demobilization. It's about a controlled shutdown of all but the most essential parts of our economy. And only later are we likely to see that mobilization phase, a reboot and refloating of the economy, hopefully one that points in new directions that we've been pushing for years. So there are really important immediate battles to be fought over about how to manage that first phase, how to do support for incomes, how to do basic planning to get essential goods, food, medicines to where they need to be, a moratorium on evictions and debt payments and the like, control public takeovers of stricken industries on the right terms. And we at the Collaborative are already engaged in many of those conversations and will continue to be so. The big prize, however, we feel is in the medium term. It's really about what comes after. How do we use this moment to shape that? And Marjorie's memo, which was shared with the trustees, collects some of the initial thinking from our programs on that. But some of us have also been in intensive dialogue with some of our closest partner organizations in the past days and weeks. And collectively, it seems that we're starting to think in terms of 3 general scenarios regarding what could emerge afterwards. If you will, you could think of them as the good, the bad, and the ugly. Now, the good would see a full-scale mobilization around both the appropriate emergency responses and the widespread uptake afterwards of the kind of community wealth building and democratizing economic strategies that we advocate and are pursuing. It would see a new enabling democratic state that could underpin all of this. It would support incomes, mothball businesses in the meantime, extend public and other forms of democratic ownership. And when the time is right, it would launch a Green New Deal and a fundamental reordering of our economy. That's the scenario that we hope to see. The bad would probably see an attempted reversion after the initial crisis responses to the status quo ante, a rerun of the kinds of responses that we saw to the great financial crisis, a reinstallation, if you like, of globalized neoliberal corporate capitalism with all its contradictions and crises. This would be bailouts of the banks and the corporate sector with very little for the rest of us, and would lead to increased inequality and precarity, the same story that we're all very familiar with. Unfortunately, we think that's not the worst that could happen. There's also the ugly. The ugly would be full-on shock doctrine disaster response combining state authoritarianism with an ongoing uncontrolled capitalism. It would tend in the direction of fascism, or at least a rabid illiberalism. It would see a racialized police state with the suspension of basic liberties, a vicious reactive right-wing populist politics. We've already had a taste of this, but I do think we need to acknowledge that things can get far, far worse than Trump. So at TDC, we want to do everything we can to bring out about the good scenario. And we're looking at the following lines of inquiry as extremely fruitful potential avenues of discussion, debate, advocacy, organizing, and action. First, we think this could potentially be a reverse Wizard of Oz moment in which we see the rise of new state capacity and capability. We've been told for decades that the state is this shrunken and withered thing, incapable of standing up to corporate power, that it's been undermined, that it's threadbare. The crisis actually is tearing back the curtain, and what it's revealing is not this pathetic figure of neoliberal imagination, but actually the state in the form of the new Leviathan. In this scenario, all things are possible: basic income, a green economy, provision of universal basic services, unlimited monetary interventions, vastly expanded public ownership, national economic planning. And so at TDC, we'll be looking to see whether we can pave the way for some very large-scale interventions and big plays, whether it be in the health system, the financial system, the energy sector. QE for the planet, for example, our proposed buyout of the oil and gas sector used to cost $1 trillion. Today, we could do it for 600 billion. Tomorrow, who knows? Similarly, Ted mentioned the public option in pharma that was once a radical proposal. Now it's a commonplace demand, and it may well actually happen. Same thing with things like equity stakes in exchange for bailouts. Thomas first floated this idea in his paper on the crisis next time in banking. It's now already a moderate demand and a rallying point for organizing. So we basically helped come up with this framework of buyouts, not bailouts, that is framing much of the progressive response to the crisis. Very quickly, two final points. Institutional design for the crisis and aftermath. We at TDC have some special skills. We need to get really clever and really focused, really fast in terms of how to further shape the direction that things are moving in. We have the capacity to do the kind of political, economic, institutional design that's needed now, and we need to use that capacity and deploy it to great effect. One quick example, Marjorie's mentioned this, employee ownership business conversions. We've been relying on a strategy in the past of the notion of the silver tsunami of baby boomer retirees. We now need to renovate that strategy for a new reality that is now upon us. If we see a controlled shutdown of the economy for many, many months, and that's protracted, what happens to our businesses? It's not impossible that 50, 60, 80% of small businesses in America could go to the wall. Maybe it's less, but it will still be very significant. Waiting in the wings, as Marjorie said, is vulture capital, private equity that would like to gobble up these businesses for pennies on the dollar. So what if we were to find a way to really push forward a proposal to acquire and mothball these businesses in a public holding company, something like FDR's Reconstruction Finance Corporation, that could hold them for the duration of the crisis and then refloat them under democratic management when the economy reboots and the stimulus kicks in. Maybe this isn't exactly the right approach, but something else like it might be. No one else is going to think this way, and so it falls to us. The last thing I want to say very briefly is we need, in a sense, a manifesto for these new times, which could, if we play our cards right, be a new era of community wealth. I don't really fully know yet how to articulate this, but I know there's something there, and we've begun to feel our way into it in our conversations internally and with our partners. It's the idea that the post-crisis aftermath might be our moment, not just to build a few more co-ops or advance a few more community wealth initiatives, not just to create a slightly more favorable environment for our work, but really to do the whole damn thing, to make community wealth the idea whose time really now has come, to rebuild our broken economy on the basis of a relocalization and democratization of economic activity, to make these ideas the new common sense in an era of planning, public ownership, the recognition that we need far greater resilience, local control, and community. We're already seeing an interesting politics of mutual aid springing up all over. People are recognizing their interconnectedness. We don't quite know how yet, but if we can lead with our values and our vision in this moment, we could be reaching out for a very, very big prize indeed. And finally, this brings us to leadership. I know I speak for all the executives and for many at TDC when I say that we really feel called to lead in this moment. And we're literally, as Ted said, being told that by our allies, by our partners, by our funders. Don't want to be smug or self-righteous, but we were way ahead of the curve on this thing. We've been pointing to the systemic nature of the problems and solutions for a long time. And in a matter of weeks, the political and economic discourse has just shifted markedly in our direction. Massive government interventions, public ownership, nationalization, income guarantees, and so on. We're pretty much the only real game in town on some of these things. And as you heard, the webinar we had yesterday on nationalization had almost 500 live participants. We're being sought out all over the place. The big green environmental groups are getting on board with nationalizing fossil fuels. Our public option in pharma is being taken up. We were among the very few who saw this coming, and we've done our homework. And so with your leadership and support, we look forward to stepping forward into this moment in history to make it our moment. Thank you. We're really very much looking forward to your guidance on all of this.
That was fantastic.